Okay, once again, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to the Infosim webinar, Managing End-to-End VoIP Networks. My name is John Olson. I'm the VP of Technical Services for the Americas, and I'll be running the webinar today. A couple of quick notes. Everyone is automatically muted on this webinar to keep down the background noise. If you do have questions, would like to ask a question, in the GoToWebinar control panel, there is an area to ask a question. You can simply type it in, and myself or one of the other moderators will pick up the question and will answer it for you. Either during the session or at the end, I will open up the floor for additional questions. So with that, we're going to get started. It should take about half an hour to 45 minutes today to go through the webinar. We want to provide the information to you and then let everyone get back to work as soon as possible. So with that, we will get started. For those of you who are not familiar with Infosim, very quickly, I'll talk about the company. We've been around for about 10 years, over 10 years now. We are a privately owned, highly profitable company headquartered in Germany, but with subsidiaries in the US and Asia and the UK. Over 300 enterprise, telco, and service provider clients. And we focus on network performance and service assurance for those clients. We have a single solution called StableNet, but that solution is broken down basically into three major modules or categories of things that we do: configuration, performance, and fault management. Within each of those, we do offer a single unified platform, a unified code base, a single database solution, which allows for a very ultra-scalable architecture and automation benefits tremendously. Due to those benefits and that automation and that scale, we deliver massive ROI in months, not just years. We are a truly vendor agnostic solution as well. Today I'm focusing on voice over IP specifically, but just as a general rule, the product StableNet is vendor agnostic. The small list of vendors you see here is just a representation. We can support we do support additional vendors. We can even then extend that to support new devices, new manufacturers, new vendors very quickly using our advanced scripting and template engine. So if you do have any questions about that, we'd certainly be happy to talk about that either offline or contact your local Infosim representative, and we can talk about the products that you have in your environment. So today we're going to be talking specifically about voice over IP management and what StableNet can do. The way we'll be discussing it is by approaching an overall architecture picture that is generic but also very real life, and then discussing where Infosim fits and a number of best practices that we've identified for trying to monitor that network. What we have found is that outside of StableNet, there are lots of VoIP management solutions that are available in the marketplace. It wouldn't be very hard to search online and find lots of folks who say that they can do this. But what we have found is most of those tools tend to focus on the performance elements. They tend to only look at some of the performance KPIs, things that we do as well, but then they generally stop there. And what we have found is that they tend to make assumptions based on the infrastructure running properly, some other system perhaps, looking at fault management, lifecycle management, vulnerability, lots of things we're going to talk about. But we don't really feel that's the best way to go. VoIP itself as an application really is an end-to-end application, starting at a phone someplace and ending at another phone, and in between there's lots of services, there's lots of devices, there's lots of transport that carry that data. And you really need to monitor that. You need a single end-to-end holistic solution that can look at all of those things in the middle and not just focus on one particular aspect. There are quite a few solutions that may just look at one or two of those things, but very few solutions that can look at everything from an end-to-end service quality management perspective. And StableNet is a platform that can do that. As we look at a slide that kind of details some possibilities for a VoIP and video, really, uh, um, deployment, what we'll talk about today actually is good for a number of different possibilities. A standard enterprise that has deployed or is thinking about deploying voice over IP on their network, and what StableNet can do for them. But there's also service providers that or maybe a managed service provider that has been tasked with managing the infrastructure for their client, and then also possibly a hybrid or even fully hosted solution where some of the components, the call managers and some of the other components, will actually be hosted on the service provider, and only the phones and maybe a few other pieces, of course, gateways and things, will be on the enterprise. And so there's lots of different possibilities for how VoIP can be deployed, especially in large organizations. And with that come individual challenges across each of those different platforms, and we'll talk about that. In any of those cases, StableNet is able to really reach in and grab the information that's needed across all of the different things that we do to support monitoring and managing those VoIP infrastructures. And we'll sort of go through those from beginning to end. We begin, though, with our first best practice, which is really server and appliance discovery management. What we mean by that is most of the applications, the VoIP applications specifically, typically reside on one or more servers. And those servers are Linux servers, Windows servers. Usually there's a little bit of both. You've got call managers, you've got voicemail servers, you may have music on hold servers, you may have recorders. There's all sorts of different, extra pieces that are involved in a large-scale VoIP deployment beyond just the phones and the gateways and the call managers. There tends to be lots of extra pieces involved. And any management system needs to be able to talk to those, needs to be able to discover what they are, where they are, how they're connected, which applications are running on which servers, and then also be able to map that into discover the assets running, discover the software versions, the firmware versions, understand the basic physical infrastructure of those servers as well as the applications residing on top of them. And then the second best practice that follows along is really automation of the deployment of those systems, because they don't just stay the same forever. They grow, they change, new users are added, systems are updated or replaced, and every time something is changed, the management system needs to be able to automatically change with them. Sometimes that is a manual process, going into the EMS and adding those new systems, but in large-scale enterprises that becomes very tedious, it becomes very error-prone, and what we have found is by integrating to a CMDB or other provisioning system, CRM system, whatever it may be, within the enterprise or certainly within the service provider, that we can set up quite a bit of automation around that. So as a new system is deployed, the OSS system or CMDB tells us that it's new, tells us that it's deployed, and we can automatically then onboard those systems into StableNet. So, and then when we do that, we run our discovery process to get those in. So it all sort of works hand in hand. Without the ability to have that automation and without the ability to discover those physical server assets, you really are not going to get very far in VoIP management. The third thing then, in our best practice number 3, is around appliance patch management. Specifically, again, those things are changing after a while. They're older. They typically need to be upgraded. New patches are applied, whether those are to patch bug fixes or potential vulnerabilities. In either case, you need to be able to track those applications, track what revision they are, and really bring that into your overall design rules for compliance, vulnerability, lifecycle processes, etc. So not just discovery of what they are, but continual discovery of what they are and the ability to potentially apply assessments to what you have to determine their level of workability in your system. And best practice number 4 is then template, what we call template management. StableNet as a platform uses a concept of templates to automatically apply measurements and monitors. Again, our terminology for measurements, very simply extracting KPIs from the systems that are important to the performance and fault of the system. And then the monitors are either applying a threshold to that system or taking other fault information, maybe from a log, a trap server, syslogs, things like that. A single template is able to be applied to a large number of systems, and if you need to make a change, you only have to change something on that template, and then it immediately can be applied to all of the devices under management of that template. So that obviously, number 1, makes it quite easy to change. If you do have additional KPIs or want to change a monitor, you only have to change it in the template. And number 2, it increases the simplicity of onboarding new systems. As a new system comes online, it gets discovered, that template gets applied, and it immediately is under the management in the correct way that it should be for whatever type of system it is. So by using a template management system, you really can automate and much more easily deploy the monitoring of network elements, and specifically voice over IP elements. The next piece is now looking at extending from the servers onto the LAN. Of course, those servers are connected into the LAN to process and pass those VoIP packets, and they're connected into switches, and the switches are connected into the routing infrastructure and so on. And unlike in other systems that tend to focus either on just the LAN or maybe just on the VoIP systems, of course, StableNet is able to span across both of those areas. Most importantly, you look for typical things like the speeds of the interfaces connected, duplex mismatches, quality of service configurations, all very important when it is related to voice over IP transport. And what's nice about what StableNet can do is essentially map the application running on the server and then the server into the LAN infrastructure. This is obviously very helpful for root cause analysis when there are problems, to be able to identify who is affected, what services are affected, and where that root cause is. And again, this all happens in an automatic way in StableNet. The best practices related to LAN management are essentially similar to what I've described before. It's the ability to discover those devices, to automatically apply templates to those devices, to understand the asset management piece of those systems, and then to also be able to go further down the line in terms of configuration management, backing up the configs, potentially rolling out configs in an automated fashion, doing policy checks and so on on those devices against compliance standards. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. But essentially, you have to be able to bring in the LAN under management in the same system that you're bringing in the VoIP systems under management for that single picture service view. The next best practice is related to now policy assurance operations. So you're monitoring those network devices, you're watching them for performance information and for fault information, but you also probably have some requirements related to policies, whether those are governmental policies or just internal policies that you have applied to the configurations of those devices. Here in the U.S. And across the world, there's PCI compliance, payment card industry compliance. If you're taking credit card information, especially over the phone, now all of your VoIP systems come under the purview of the PCI compliance. When you get audited, they're going to look at all of the systems related to that, and they need to know that you're running compliance checks. StableNet's NCCM module allows for those compliance policy checking systems to be made available. They can run automatically. They can potentially even remediate any problems automatically. And again, that's just one more piece of the overall view that in other products or other vendors either is not supported or it's a separate piece. So you've got your policy checking, but it's completely separate from your discovery engine or your performance management engine. With StableNet, that's not the case. It's all still under the same end-to-end holistic view. When you're now getting down a little bit deeper into the specific VoIP requirements on the LAN that we're still talking about. So you must have QoS trust configured. You're watching those VoIP packets. Typically now you're getting into some of the performance metrics related to round trip times, and loss and jitter and other things that we'll talk about later. But it's really important now that the same system can begin to take those deeper level VoIP specific performance metrics from the LAN environment and apply that into an overall picture describing the performance of the network. So StableNet has the capability of taking those performance stats from the devices themselves and potentially even from phones or other third-party servers, a variety of mechanisms, and getting that information in specifically related to LAN QoS. And best practice number 8 is around high availability monitoring. So VoIP, still today, voice is the primary means of communication globally. Most business is still done in some way, shape, or form related to voice. In the past, the 5 nines reliability that everybody was used to in the standard or traditional TDM, PBX world is much more complex in a voice over IP scenario. In TDM, you had a handset, you had your PBX server, and there weren't too many other things that could get involved to cause problems. It was an entirely separate cabling infrastructure. It was not related at all to data. It didn't really have some of the issues that you see in a data network or potentially see in a data network. But you still need to have that reliability. It still needs to be up, and it needs to be up all the time, because you're either you as a customer or as a service provider providing these services, your customers are not going to accept unavailability of their voice systems or problems, drop calls, echo on calls, things like that. So high availability monitoring is still incredibly important, still trying to achieve something close to the 5 nines reliability, and again, bringing that same fault monitoring into the platform, in addition to the service monitoring, the application monitoring, the performance metrics that we've talked about, into that single picture view is incredibly important. Moving forward now, we're extending out the view of the VoIP infrastructure. We now, of course, talk about the WANs. Most systems are connected to some sort of WAN, whether that's an internal WAN for other locations or that's to your service provider, maybe as a gateway to a traditional TDM network, or as a SIP trunk. It doesn't matter. You now, the WAN is a key component in the VoIP delivery path. Ultimately, the WAN is what delivers that call flow from the VoIP environment to, of course, remote locations. And there are important things related to WANs, primarily consistency of QoS configurations on the WAN side, in conjunction with the LAN side. So if the environment is completely under your control, your WAN, that can be a little bit easier to detect. If the WAN environment now is partly under your control but partly an MPLS service or some other type of service from a carrier, being able to identify the QoS configurations on those devices is a bit more complex, but nonetheless is incredibly important to monitoring the overall health of the VoIP network. Specifically, the WAN QoS, as I mentioned, the configuration of the QoS policies and queues on those WAN systems needs to be consistent, needs to be the same. I have been in many customers where they're having VoIP quality issues, and ultimately what it came down to was just misconfigurations or inconsistent configurations of the quality of service parameters on the WAN side. Two interfaces connected to each other with different setups and the problems that causes. StableNet's policy checking engine is very easily can be very easily set up to identify those misconfigurations. Using a policy checking engine, again, in an automated fashion, usually at least once a day, to pull the backups of the configs and apply those backups against the policy for a known good configuration. Because even though the configuration may have been good on day one, that doesn't mean day one plus those configurations are the same. People are constantly going in, they're changing things, they mistakenly affect something that they didn't mean to, and suddenly the voice quality is diminished and nobody knows why. By using a policy checking engine such as StableNet, those things can be identified immediately once a check has been made that this violates the policy, and someone can be alerted, and potentially even policy could be rolled back automatically. Incredibly important to VoIP quality. So that WAN device management, the best practice number 9, is really enabling the management of voice across not just the LAN, but now across the WAN, and identifying both the KPIs on that WAN as well, because you want to look at those interfaces, you want to look for the queues to see if there's overruns, to see if there's drops, etc. But also the configurations of those, as we describe in best practice number 10, the QoS management. So you have to the idea is to mark those packets as close to the edge of the source as possible, classify them in the elements, make sure capacity planning is an important piece of this as well. So it's the QoS, but it's also the capacity that the packets are riding over. All of those capabilities, capacity, trending, and actual configuration management are possible with StableNet in a single unified platform. One of the ways that you can identify or begin to identify potential problems is by doing a WAN assessment. There are a number of VoIP vendors out there, I know of I in particular and others, actually demand a WAN assessment be undertaken initially before they will deploy a system. They want to make sure that those things I've just described are set up properly, there aren't any gotchas out there, etc. There are tools out there that can do those WAN assessments, but those tools typically are point solutions. That's all they do. They have no knowledge. They can't discover the network. They can't look at configurations. They're usually just sort of packet pushers across the bandwidth and identifying things. And while that does a very specific job, it really I think doesn't relate very well into the holistic picture, and most of the time those products then go away after the VoIP system has been deployed. The manufacturer demands ahead of time that this assessment is done, but does not necessarily demand that any follow-up assessments are done. And of course, you know, as networks change and grow and more people are using VoIP, or a new application comes online that's also chewing up some of the bandwidth, those assessments need to be carried on again and again in a periodic fashion. StableNet includes the capability of doing those WAN assessments. We have a measurement capability where we can create an RTP stream. You can choose the volume of that stream, the codec that you want to use, the quality of service markings, and we can then get back all of the important parameters, loss, delay, jitter, etc. We can make a MOS score available. And we can do this in an ongoing basis, so it's not just taken out after the system has been deployed, but this type of test could be run every 10 minutes or something like that. It's just to constantly make sure that you see the things that you expect to see, and suddenly if capacity on the link has you know, begun to decrease, or the availability of capacity has begun to decrease, StableNet can alert you to that. Another way of identifying potential issues is by best practice number 12, which is enabling NetFlow on the WAN specifically. NetFlow is a great tool, a great technology to get further insight into what's happening through those interfaces. Especially with version 9 of NetFlow or flexible NetFlow, IPFix, flexible NetFlow variants, you can really add a lot of information to those NetFlow exports. You can enhance that visibility greatly. You can now see what percentage of my traffic is being used, assuming that you're mixing, let's say, VoIP traffic on a WAN interface, which you typically are, with data traffic. What percentage is used by one or the other? Who are the top talkers? I can now verify QoS markings on each side from the NetFlow exports. So it helps to really pinpoint trouble areas, especially on the WAN side. We highly recommend it. And of course, StableNet has the ability of taking that NetFlow data in and along with everything else, and again, adding that to the overall picture. There are other NetFlow products out there that's all they do is NetFlow. And there's other VoIP management systems that have no ability to do NetFlow. StableNet is one of the unique products that has the capability of doing all of that, and we highly recommend it as a best practice. The next piece really is just, and it's part of what we've talked about a little bit, is managing those remote offices. So, if you're an enterprise, you're going to have some remote offices. Those offices could be in a completely different part of the world. You've got maybe a small office with just a few people, or a very large office with their own call manager, their other peripheral pieces of equipment, voicemail servers, whatever they may be. You need to be able to extend the monitoring of your solution into those remote offices. And again, because of StableNet's architecture, where you can deploy agents essentially remotely. Those agents communicate back up into the overall StableNet architecture. Now, even for large offices or offices that are halfway around the world, you can bring that same management information back into the overall StableNet architecture merely by deploying an agent there, and that agent doing the local discovery, doing the local fault and performance measurements, maybe taking NetFlow locally, etc., but providing a single unified view back up into the StableNet architecture. This is, very important, obviously, for large and distributed organizations, and it really is possible because of our commitment to scalability through the way our architecture has been designed. Again, lots of other products out there just don't have the capability of extending to that sort of scale and that sort of distributed architecture. When you are doing remote office VoIP management, or if that is part of your overall infrastructure, obviously that's a best practice as well, is not just stopping at the main center, contact center, call center, office, whatever it may be, but extending all the way down as far as you can into that remote office. And many times those remote offices may include soft phones, potentially even people working from their homes. We have that quite a bit here in the U.S. It's important to try and get as close to those end users as possible when you're doing VoIP, because everything may look great on the core. Everything's really fast on the core, and everything's under lots of scrutiny. But once you get out to a remote office, maybe connected with lower bandwidth links, or even a user at home, it becomes much more difficult to put your finger on what's happening there. But that is incredibly important. And through some of the techniques that StableNet offers, again, using remote agents or other performance gathering possibilities, we can get close to identifying what's happening even on those remote sites. Best practice number 14 is related specifically to voice recorder management. We deal a lot, again, with large organizations, call centers, contact centers that have requirements around recording all voice conversations. So it may be a legal requirement specifically for them, or just a general business requirement. Those voice recorders are incredibly large systems. They use a lot of capacity. They're always back-ended, of course, with some sort of storage network, and are typically connected into the overall LAN via a span port or mirror port. We see this a lot quite often in the financial services industry, as they have, again, legal requirements for recording. And so one of the things that just needs to be watched out for is related to configuration management of those switches where the voice recording systems are plugged in. Those spans, those mirror ports, need to be configured properly, and they need to be the same all over the place. If a system is added or a system is being replaced, the new system has to, of course, be set up in the same way that the previous system was. Otherwise, you begin losing those sessions. And StableNet, of course, with our config management and policy checking engines, are able to identify and make sure that those switch ports are set up exactly the way they were previously. There's a lot involved in just making sure that these peripheral systems, whether they're voice recording systems or, again, IVR systems, music on hold systems, CTI systems, whatever they are functioning properly within the scope of the overall VoIP portfolio. And then along the same lines, we highly recommend bringing the handsets themselves into the management or under the scope of the overall management platform. Even if you have thousands or tens of thousands of phones, it actually is one of our best practices to try and bring those phones into the overall management system. Phones today, VoIP phones in particular, they're IP connected. Obviously, they offer some management capabilities usually, and certainly it's important to understand from an asset management perspective what models you have, what revisions of code they're running. Handset manufacturers are constantly either introducing new features or fixing bugs and releasing new patches for those phones. And if you've got 20 or 30,000 phones or more under management, or even just 1,000 phones under management, trying to understand, and keep track of the assets of those phones, what version of software they're running, can be nearly impossible unless you're doing it within some overall network management product like StableNet. Oftentimes, these phones are also capable of providing quality of service metric information via an RTCP report or something like that out to a third-party system like StableNet. So we can receive those RTCP reports. We can then report on quality of service of phone calls directly, as reported by the phones themselves for loss and delay and jitter and so on. And of course, assign thresholds if we see something fall below a threshold, or above a threshold, depending on the metric, then we can alert directly on that. So getting those phones, although it may seem a bit of a tedious process or task, getting those phones into the system under management is important. But you can only do that if your management system is capable of having that large-scale amount of number of devices into the platform as StableNet can. Lastly, now there's the actual VoIP performance monitoring. I've talked a lot about infrastructure and systems and the LAN and the WAN and the servers and so on, and that's obviously all very important. But at the end of the day, you also need to monitor the performance of the VoIP packets themselves, and you monitor those differently than you would monitor a traditional data packet. You need to look at latency. You need to look at jitter. You need to look at loss. We also roll those up into the standard MOS scores and R-factor scores that are industry standards out there. We can take those measurements either directly, again, from the phones, directly off of the LAN by use of our own VoIP measurements, as I talked about in the VoIP testing slide. So our agents have the capability of doing end-to-end measurements between themselves and collecting the statistics I've mentioned. We can now run those measurements and those agents on very low-cost hardware platforms. So think even a Raspberry Pi type platform, very, very low cost, easy to be distributed at many different locations and run those VoIP measurements and gather these statistics. We can also get them from certain call manufacturers, make the CDR, CMR type reports from the call managers available through some sort of outside interface, and we can pull those statistics as well. So no matter how we get it, from the LAN devices themselves, through the phones themselves, through our synthetic transaction measurement, what have you, getting those VoIP metrics into the overall platform is important. And specifically, loss is incredibly valuable of a statistic to use most of the time something like 1% for the WAN and 0.05% for the LAN are thresholds that are critical to having good quality voice communications. Obviously, any of those thresholds can be adjusted for your particular requirements or SLAs, but those are sort of what we see as an industry standard out there. You need to be able to monitor that across the LAN, across the WAN, remote sites, down to the handset if you can, and then correlate issues. If you are seeing a number of issues at the same time, where is that coming from? And be able to drill down. And of course, StableNet, because of the holistic nature of what we can do, the end-to-end measurements allows for that. Jitter management is very similar, best practice number 17. So that's another key performance statistics related specifically to voice over IP networks that needs to be monitored. It's part of the overall MOS score algorithm, but even just in and of itself is very important. And being able to watch those jitter calculations from both the source to the destination and the destination to the source, looking at it in a per direction way and not just one number, is another valuable statistic, and certainly one that you would have to bring in under management to effectively monitor a VoIP system. You can get some of those things also from things like Cisco IPSLA. Other manufacturers have similar quality performance monitoring built in. StableNet is capable of taking those IPSLA or IPSLA-like measurements directly from the vendors without having to even set them up through the CLI on the vendor equipment. So StableNet, you tell StableNet what IPSLA measurements you want and how often you want to run them. StableNet then takes care of communicating to the devices, setting up those measurements, tearing them down, and providing the statistics back into our overall product. We also, again, as I mentioned on best practice number 19, is the ability to simulate that IPSLA-like measurements outside of the routers themselves. So you don't have to load your routers with those measurements. We can do them outside of that through an end-to-end synthetic transaction multimedia measurement running on our agents, and those agents can then be deployed anywhere. So unlike IPSLA, which stops at the router, it just goes router to router, by using our agents to do the test, you can now go further, deeper, down to the access layer, even potentially down to a desktop simulating an endpoint with a test, and still bringing all of the key thresholds, bandwidth, capacity, loss, delay, jitter, and so on. So there's a number of different potential methodologies of getting all of this information in. At the end of the day, we view this and what StableNet can do as a holistic end-to-end picture. It begins with that device discovery, including the servers and the LAN and WAN devices. It moves through the individual applications and performance metrics and everything else that I've talked about: configuration management, synthetic transactions, policy enforcement, and so on. Bringing all of that into one view where you get the performance, you get the fault, you get the config, you get reporting, of course, around all of that. You get multi-tenancy, you get huge scale, and ultimately what you get is total service visibility across the entire VoIP estate with StableNet. There's a number of really good resources available to you. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available. The actual PowerPoint that I'm using is will also be made available to anyone who wishes to have it. There is a really good voice over IP white paper that has recently been created and delivered. You can pull that right off of our website that goes into even greater detail than I did today on these particular topics. And of course, if you have any questions, you can always contact your local Infosim representative, and they would be more than happy to go into this, to talk to you, to explain in more detail what we can do across that estate. So I'm going to now open it for questions. So I've gone about 40 minutes, and We have a few minutes left. I'm happy to answer any questions. Again, you can just type those into the chat area in the GoToWebinar panel, and we'll take a look at those. If not, if I have already given you hopefully the information you were looking for, then we just want to say thank you. We appreciate your time joining the webinar today, and we look forward to communicating with you more in the future. So I'll leave this open for a couple minutes and see if there are any questions. Well, at this point, it doesn't look like there are any questions, so hopefully that means the information was good and answered anything that you had. Again, lots of resources available to you through the website, through our YouTube channel, Infosim TV, and through your local Infosim representative. So I want to thank everyone for joining today. I really appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you more in the future. Bye.